The Age of Angels Liu Cixin Prologue, the attack on Zambia, was about to begin. Operation First Ethic
had brought 3 aircraft carrier battle groups to the African coast more than 10 days earlier. The fleet deployed around the Lincoln carrier group spread across the sea like a solemn chessboard laid upon the Atlantic.
Dusk had fallen. The fleet's searchlights converged on the Lincoln's flight deck, where more than 1,000 Marines and naval aviators stood in ordered ranks. At the front of the formation stood First Ethic,
Operations Supreme Commander General Felix, and the Lincoln's captain, General Blair. Felix was tall and lean, with the bearing of a scholar. Blair was thick-set and hard, the image of an old sailor. At the starting point of the steam catapult, facing the ranks, stood a military chaplain in a black cassock. Holding a Bible, he began the prayer written for this expedition.
Almighty Lord, we come from the civilized world. Along our way we have seen how you rule the earth, the sky, the seas, and every living creature upon this world. Every cell that composes us is steeped in your majesty. Now demons have appeared on this distant continent, attempting to usurp your sacred and supreme authority, to pluck the strings of life with their filthy hands. Grant us the sword of justice, that we may sweep away the demons and preserve your dignity and glory. Amen.
His voice echoed in the sea wind, a wind carrying the earthy smell of the African continent. It immersed everyone in a solemnity and sanctity, deeper and broader than the sea beneath their feet. Under the meteor-like streaks of cruise missiles passing overhead, they bowed and answered with devotion from the depths of their souls.
Amen. Part 1, the chairman rose, trying to calm the American representative, then turned toward Ita. With tears of grief and anger in his eyes, he said,
Doctor, you and your country may have violated the United Nations Biosafety Treaty at its highest prohibition by reprogramming the human genome. But you should never have been so brazen as to come to this sacred place and fling filth into the face of all humanity. You have violated the first ethic. You have pulled away the cornerstone of human civilization.
Ever since the human genome had been sequenced, people had known that the crisis brought by rapidly advancing molecular biology would come sooner or later. The United Nations Biosafety Council had been founded to prevent precisely that crisis. It possessed authority equal to the existing Security Council. It reviewed all major biological research projects around the world, judged whether they were legal, and then voted on whether they should be terminated.
Today, the Biosafety Council would convene its 119th regular session. It would accept an application from Zambia and review a genetic engineering achievement submitted by that country. By convention, the applicant nation did not disclose the nature of its achievement when applying, but revealed it only after the meeting began. This created a problem. Many achievements submitted by small countries were found, at the very opening of a session, to fall far below the level required for review. Yet none of the member state representatives dared to take lightly what this poorest African nation had submitted, because the work had been done by Nobel laureate Dr. Ita, founder of genetic software engineering.
Dr. Ita came in. The black man, already past 50, wore Zambian national dress, which was in fact a large, heavy piece of cloth. His bony body seemed unable to bear even the weight of that cloth, and he bent beneath it like an old branch. He bowed even lower, slowly inclining himself toward every side of the round table. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. His movements were so slow they became almost unbearable, and the process went on for a long time. The Indian representative whispered to the American representative beside him.
Who does he remind you of?
The American representative said,
An old servant.
The Indian representative shook his head. The American looked at him, then at Ita. You mean Gandhi? Oh, yes, very much so. The rotating chairman of the Biosafety Council stood and declared the meeting open. After inviting Ita to sit beside him, he said,
Dr. Ita is familiar to all of us. Although he has lived in seclusion in recent years, the scientific community has not forgotten him. Still, according to convention, we will give a brief introduction. Dr. Ita is Zambian. 32 years ago, he received his doctorate in computer science from MIT, then returned to his homeland to work in software research. 10 years later, he abruptly turned to molecular biology and achieved the results known to all of us.
He turned to Ita and asked,
Doctor, I have a question, purely out of curiosity. When you left software science for molecular biology, was there another reason besides your foresight into the wonderful union of software engineering and genetic engineering? Disappointment in what computer technology could bring to your homeland?
Computers are false gods for the poor,
Ita said slowly. It was the first time he had spoken since entering. Understandable. Although the Zambian government was then working hard to promote informatization in large cities like the capital, most of the country still had no electricity. When molecular biology's techniques for manipulating and analyzing biological macromolecules reached a certain height, the discipline faced its ultimate goal: to alter the traits of organisms by recombining genes, and eventually to create new life. At that point, the science would undergo a profound transformation, from manipulating enormous quantities of information. For traditional molecular biology, still somewhat distant from mathematics, this was extraordinarily difficult. Directly manipulating 4 bases to code genes and produce a desired organism was as unimaginable as directly programming Windows XP with zeros and ones.
Ita was the first to perceive this sharply. He revealed the common essence of genetic engineering and software engineering, and applied the already solid foundations of software engineering to molecular biology. He first invented a macro-assembly language for gene programming, then created a procedural high-level genetic language called
Life Basic. When the object-oriented high-level genetic language Eden++ appeared, humanity truly possessed a pair of God's hands.
People then discovered to their astonishment that creating life was in fact programming. God, it turned out, was a programmer. At the same time, programmers became gods. Those disheveled young men who had once drifted through Silicon Valley or one technology park or another began to slip into the life sciences. They lived 2 days asleep and 3 days awake. Many could not distinguish organic matter from inorganic matter, but they were efficient programming machines. One day, a project manager handed a disk to one of these temporary gods and told him that it contained 2 uncompiled genetic program modules and that he needed to write an interface program for them.
After agreeing on the price, the god took the disk back to his sweltering attic and began a week of creation at his computer. He had nothing in common with God as he worked. He looked much more like a slave. A week later, he staggered up from the computer, took another copied disk from the drive, waded through cigarette butts and instant coffee packets up to his calves, and went to the life sciences company to hand the disk to the project manager. The manager placed it into a gene compiler. At the center of a spherical transparent vessel, molecular probes invisible to the naked eye delicately teased the chromosomes of several plant cells.
The cells were then placed in nutrient solution in a test tube and cultured until they grew into a tiny cluster of plants. Later, the plant was moved into a soilless cultivation workshop, grown into a sapling, transplanted into a tropical plantation, and finally became a banana tree. When the first heavy bunch of fruit was cut from the tree, you broke off a banana, peeled it, and found inside an enormous orange segment. Of course, all this was only a vivid metaphor. Actual genetic software development was a vast engineering project far beyond the power of an individual. The code required merely to write the genetic software for a retinal photoreceptor cell was comparable to that of the latest Windows operating system.
Therefore, creating new life entirely by gene programming was still limited to the level of viruses. Scientists preferred to separate functional modules and functions from natural genes. then obtain organisms with new traits by referencing and combining those modules and functions. For this, the object-oriented genetic programming language,
Eden Plus was a powerful tool. Dr. Ita, before we formally begin the agenda, I would like to remind you, you look very weak. The chairman said to Ita with concern. A Zambian official stood and said,
Gentlemen, Dr. Ita eats very little each day. You must know that Zambia is now facing a severe drought, and the doctor has chosen to go hungry with his people. The French representative said,
Last month, as a member of a UN Development Program inspection team, I visited Zambia and 2 neighboring disaster-stricken countries. The drought there is truly terrible. If large-scale relief does not arrive in time, many people will starve to death in the second half of the year.
Still, Dr. Ita,
The American representative said,
as a scientist engaged in basic research, an excessive sense of responsibility can affect your work and in the end may prevent you from fulfilling your responsibility at all.
Ita nodded, half rose, and bowed slightly to him. You are quite right. Alas, a defect left from childhood and hard to change. Would you gentlemen like to hear something about my childhood?
This was plainly off topic, but out of respect, no one made a sound. Ita began to speak in a low, slow voice, as if murmuring to himself from inside memory.
That was also a year of great drought. The earth was like a stove full of cracks. Snakes that had died of thirst were dried by the fierce sun, and when your foot stepped on them, they crumbled into powder. Zambia was then in years of civil war, the war manipulated by the Eastern political bloc to overthrow the Busano regime. Our village was abandoned. There was nothing to eat. Yala went to eat dry grass and leaves. Yala was my little sister, just old enough to understand things, with very large eyes. She went to eat dry grass and leaves.
Ita's voice was flat and monotonous, like early speech software reading a text file. Her whole body swelled from eating them, and her intestines became blocked. That night she had something in her mouth. It clicked against her teeth. I asked what she was holding there. She said she was eating candy. She had tasted candy only once before, a year earlier, when a Soviet advisor came to the village to recruit guerrillas and gave her a piece. I saw a streak of blood run from her mouth, so I pried it open. What Yala held was not a lump of candy. It was an arrowhead, coated with rattlesnake venom, the kind used to shoot jackals. Her last words to me were, "Yala hurts. Yala does not want to live anymore. When Yala dies, brother can eat Yala, and then brother will have strength to walk to the city. I heard there is food there." I still remember the moon that night, rising from the far end of the drought-stricken land, dim and red. I did not eat my little sister, but that year in the village, cannibalism really did happen. Some old people left wills saying that after they starved to death, the children should eat them.
The hall fell into a long silence. The chairman said,
Doctor, we now understand your efforts over the past 10 years and more to improve crops through genetic software technology.
Nothing accomplished at all. Ida shook his head and sighed.
When Zambia first became independent, we once dreamed of building paradise on the land of our ancestors. Later, we learned that on a land so heavily burdened with suffering, expectations for life cannot be too high. The bottom line of our ideals kept retreating. We no longer wanted industrialization. We no longer wanted democracy. We might even be able to give up the dignity of the nation and the individual. But the Zambian people's demand of life cannot retreat any further. We cannot stop eating. 2/3 of this country are still hungry. We must find a way.
Ita's words stirred a great reaction in the hall, and the representatives began whispering among themselves. The American representative said,
Africa is indeed a continent left behind by the progress of civilization. But, Doctor, this is a problem involving many complex social, political, historical, and geographic factors. It is not something scientists can solve merely with the science in their hands.
Ita shook his head and said,
No. Science may truly be able to solve hunger. The key is that we must change our direction of thought.
The representatives looked blankly at one another. The chairman was the first to think of something and said, "If I have not misunderstood, Dr. Ita has already begun the agenda of this meeting." Ita said solemnly,
Yes, Mr. Chairman. If you permit, before introducing our research achievement, I would first like the gentleman here to meet a child, a Zambian child who can eat his fill.
He waved his hand, and a black boy entered the meeting hall. His upper body was bare, his muscles full, his skin glossy. Beneath thick curls, his large eyes shone with life. With strong, light steps, he brought a surge of vigorous vitality into the hall.
Ah, what a little Othello!
Someone exclaimed. Ita introduced him.
This is Kato, 12 years old, a native-born Zambian child. Of course, in Zambia, where average life expectancy is only a little over 40, someone his age is usually no longer considered a child. But Kato is indeed a child, and a young child, because his lifespan is certain to exceed that of everyone seated here.
That is not surprising. One can see that the boy is very well nourished,
said one of the physicians among the representatives. With his hands on Kato's shoulders, Ita looked around the hall and said,
He must be very different from the Zambian children you imagine. Hungry children have thin necks supporting oversized heads, limbs as withered as branches, bellies swollen with fluid, flies on their faces, sores on their bodies. So you see, as long as they can eat their fill, the children of any people can become as noble as angels.
Kato nodded in greeting to everyone, and loudly said something no one could understand.
He is greeting you, gentlemen.
Ita said, Kato speaks only Zambian.
You said just now that this child was born and raised in Zambia.
The chairman asked. Yes, and he grew up in the poorest region of Zambia and has never left it. In this drought, many people in his hometown have starved to death. Everyone stared fixedly at the strong black child. For a moment, no one could speak.
For the first time, a faint smile appeared on Ita's face. Naturally, your next question is, what does he eat there? So now I will ask you to watch Kato eat lunch.
After saying this, he waved again toward the door. 3 people entered the hall. 2 were Zambian officials attending the meeting. The third startled everyone. He was a New York policeman. His belt was burdened with a pistol, a baton, a radio, and other gear. He carried a large plastic bag, and after entering he stopped hesitantly.
We invited this officer into the hall.
Ita said to the chairman. The chairman gestured for the policeman to come forward.
The policeman walked to the round table. 2 representatives made room for him. He dumped everything in the large plastic bag onto the tabletop. First came a large bundle of green grass, then a pile of plane tree leaves, and finally a heap of dark green pine needles. The policeman pointed at the grass and leaves, then at the 2 Zambian officials who had come in with him, and said,
These 2 gentlemen were pulling grass from the lawn in the courtyard. I went to stop them, and they brought me here.
Ita stood and bowed to the policeman. Respected officer, I apologize for our rudeness and am willing to pay the appropriate fine. We merely wished to ask you to serve as a witness to prove that this grass and these leaves are real. The policeman widened his eyes and said,
Of course they are real. I collected them into the bag myself and carried them here the whole way.
Ita nodded. Very well. It is time for Kato to have his lunch.
The Zambian child grabbed a large handful of grass, rolled it into a thick rope, and bit off a large section as if eating a sausage. He chewed with relish, and the squeaking sound of crushed grass stems could be clearly heard. He ate quickly. In a moment the thick handful of grass was gone,
and he began devouring leaves by the mouthful.
The onlookers' reactions fell into two kinds. Some struggled to hold back the urge to vomit. Others could not keep themselves from swallowing saliva. It was a natural conditioned reflex when seeing someone else enjoy what, in his perception, was delicious, whatever that delicacy might be.
Kato rolled up another handful of grass and ate it, then began eating pine needles. The sound of his chewing changed at once. Dark green juice ran down from the corner of his mouth. With his mouth full of pine needles and grass, he cheerfully said something to Ita.
Kodo says the grass and leaves here taste better than those in Zambia.
Ita explained.
Because of the blind introduction of highly polluting industries, Zambia has become the West's dumping ground. Environmental pollution there is much worse than here.
Under everyone's gaze, Kato ate all the grass, plain tree leaves, and pine needles on the table. Satisfied, he wiped the green juice from the corner of his mouth and nodded to Ita with a smile, evidently thanking him for the delicious lunch.
In the words of a later journalist, the meeting hall fell into a hellish silence. No one knew how long it lasted before that silence was broken by the chairman's trembling voice.
So, Dr. Ita, this is the research achievement you have submitted for review by the Biosafety Council on behalf of Zambia. Ita nodded calmly. Yes. This is the change direction of thought I mentioned. Since we can use genetic engineering to modify crops, why can we not use it to modify human beings themselves? Take this Zambian child, for example. His digestive system has been reprogrammed, greatly expanding the range of food he can eat. For such new humans, farmland could be planted entirely with fast-growing or drought-resistant plants. Those wild grasses whose rampant growth once troubled us would be boundless fertile fields to them. Even if traditional crops were planted, they would harvest 10 times more food from the land than we do. For wheat, for example, they can eat the straw and even the roots.
For them, food will truly be as easy to obtain as air and sunlight. The representatives of every nation stood like stone sculptures around the great round table, focusing their dark looks on Ita. Ita bore those gazes openly and said calmly,
Honorable gentlemen, I convey President Ruviga's words to the United Nations. Zambia is prepared to bear everything for this.
The chairman was the first to recover from his stunned state. Supporting himself on the table edge, he carefully sat down, as if he had grown too weak to stand. Looking straight ahead, he said, I believe you said just now that this child is 12? Ita nodded.
Then you reprogrammed human genes 12 years ago.
Strictly speaking, it should be 15 years ago. The first batch of programming was done with a genetic assembly language. Half a year later, the programming tool was changed to the procedural high-level language, Life Basic. As for Kato, he was programmed with the object-oriented Eden++, and that was 3 years after that. We extracted large numbers of digestive system functions and submodules from herbivores, removed the ruminant parts, optimized and combined the rest, and implanted them into the genetic code of human fertilized eggs. But many of the programs, such as the composition of gastric fluid, the strength of the stomach wall, and the mode of intestinal peristalsis, borrowed no natural code at all. We compiled and developed them entirely ourselves.
Dr. Ita, what we finally wish to know is this. In Zambia, how many reprogrammed human beings are there?
Kato's batch has fewer than 100 people, because we were not yet fully confident in object-oriented programming. The reprogrammed Zambians are mainly the 2 batches from 15 years ago, programmed with macro assembly language and Life Basic. There were 21,043 fertilized eggs in all, of which 20,816 survived and were delivered normally.
With a clatter, Madame Francis, the French biologist who had won the previous Nobel Prize in biology, fainted. Beside her, another Nobel laureate, the German physiologist Dr. Stauffenberg, rotating vice chairman of the Biosafety Council, had turned purple
and was breathing rapidly. Eyes closed as he fumbled in his breast pocket for nitroglycerin tablets. Only the American representative remained calm. He pointed at Ite, turned to the still dumbfounded policeman, and said,
"Arrest him." He said it calmly, as if asking someone for a light. But when he saw the policeman standing there in confusion, the thin veil of calm was instantly destroyed, and he roared like an erupting volcano. "Did you hear me? Arrest him. Forget immunity. That applies to people, not demons."
The chairman rose, trying to calm the American representative, then turned toward Ita. With tears of grief and anger in his eyes, he said,
Doctor, you and your country may have violated the highest prohibition of the United Nations Biosafety Treaty by reprogramming the human genome, but you should never have been so brazen as to come to this sacred place and fling filth into the face of all humanity. You have violated the first ethic. You have pulled away the cornerstone of human civilization.
The cornerstone of human civilization is having food to eat. Zambians only want to eat their fill. Ita bowed to the chairman and spoke in his slow, particular tone. All right, let us adjourn. The American representative waved at the chairman as he spoke. By now he was truly calm again.
In fact, everyone expected that this would happen sooner or later. Sooner is better than later. I think you all know what we should do now. At least America knows. We must hurry and do it. With that, he left in haste.
The people in the hall dispersed, one after another. At last only Ita and Kado remained, along with the policeman. Ita held Kado's shoulders and walked toward the door. The policeman stared darkly at the child's back, one hand touching the snub-nosed revolver at his hip, and muttered,
"Someone ought to blow that little monster away."
When the news spread, the whole world was shocked.
The next day, images and photographs of Ita and Kado appeared in all the world's major media. Ita's branch-like arms held Kado tightly against his branch-like body. His eyes were always lowered to the ground, while the black child was strong and fierce, his eyes shining in sharp contrast to Ita. The two fused into one irregular black composition. They truly looked like a pair of demons.
During the 2 days the Zambian delegation remained in the United States, calls grew louder around the world to arrest them on the spot. Each day, huge protest marches filled the area before the United Nations building. Threats against the Zambian delegation, especially against Ita and Kado, personally came one after another. But the American government showed great restraint and merely announced that the delegation would be expelled.
During those 2 days, Ita held little Kado tightly day and night. In public, his eyes were always turned down. Yet, as one reporter described it, he possessed the alertness of a demon.
The slightest disturbance around him, he would immediately shield the child behind him and raise his head to stare toward the source of the abnormality. His eye sockets were very deep, and his whole gaze seemed hidden in darkness. A demon, perfectly alive.
The Zambian government proposed sending a special plane to take the delegation home. But the American government refused to allow Zambian aircraft to enter, and no other country would rent them a plane. They had to take a European passenger flight. For safety, the Zambian government bought every first-class seat. When the delegation boarded in Ita, holding Kado, walked first into the empty first-class cabin, he let out a long breath and loosened the hand that gripped Kado. As they boarded, the flight attendants showed the natural reaction one might expect when meeting demons. Their faces full of fear, they avoided them from a distance. Only one European flight attendant bravely led them into first class.
The blonde, blue-eyed young woman was beautiful and moving. The sincere smile on her face warmed the hearts of the Zambians, already chilled through. Before leaving the cabin, she pressed her palms together in an Eastern gesture learned from no one knew where and silently blessed the child. For a moment the Zambians beside her had tears in their eyes.
Then she drew a pistol and fired twice with the muzzle pressed against the child's head.
Contrary to later rumors, Dalis was absolutely not an assassin sent by the American government or by any other country. Her murder was entirely a personal act. In fact, during the Zambian delegation's stay in America, the American government had placed them under strict protection. The civilized world intended to deal with the whole nation of Zambia, and before that it did not want complications. But this final blow was impossible to guard against. The flight attendants on the airliner were equipped with anti-hijacking pistols firing oak bullets that would not damage the cabin. Generally, being hit by one was not fatal, but Dalis fired with the muzzle pressed to the child's eyes.
"I did not kill anyone! Ha ha! I did not kill anyone! Ha ha ha!" After firing, Dalis waved her blood-covered hands and cheered hysterically.
Ita held Kado's body, his eyes still lowered to the ground, and waited until Dalis quieted down. She bit her blood-soaked fingers in her mouth and stared at Ita with mad eyes. For a while the cabin was as silent as death, and the only sound was the gurgle of blood flowing from the child's head.
Girl, he was human. He was my grandson, a child who could eat his fill. Dalis was found not guilty in court and was soon turned by the media into a hero defending human dignity.
On the day after the Zambian delegation returned home, the United Nations issued an ultimatum to the Zambian government. Hand over every biologist and relevant technician in the country, hand over every reprogrammed individual, destroy all genetic engineering facilities, have the head of state report to a special tribunal to stand trial together with all other principal offenders and accomplices.
Now the whole world carefully referred to those Zambians whose genes had been reprogrammed as individuals. Zambia refused the ultimatum, and so, to uphold humanity's sacred first ethic, the civilized world began a 21st century crusade against Africa. Part 2.
Felix immediately saw that these were not the 20,000 individuals
waiting to be received, but an army unit preparing to attack. They advanced in ordered formation. Felix lowered the binoculars and could see with his naked eye that the Zambian troops were gradually covering the plain like a black carpet. He raised the binoculars again and saw the line accelerate. Among the Zambian infantry who had already rushed to the shore, a vast patch of white suddenly appeared. That white patch shook violently, raising a high cloud of dust, and for a moment the people of the fleet could not believe their eyes. Every Zambian soldier had a pair of white wings. Above the dust, the flying men rose into the air, blocking the rising sun.
"Could you stop for a moment? Watching you is making me tired. You have been pacing back and forth for more than an hour."
Captain Blair said. General Felix continued pacing with a soldier's regulation stride.
At West Point, this was one of the instructor's punishments: make a student walk back and forth in a corner of the parade ground for hours. Over time, I came to enjoy the punishment. Only at times like that could I think properly.
So you were not well liked at West Point. I was very well liked at Annapolis. They had that punishment there too, but I never received it once. In my upper-class years, though, I often used it on the new boys.
No military academy anywhere in the world likes people who love to think. Annapolis does not, West Point does not, St. Cyr and Froomes do not. Yes, thinking, especially thinking the way you do, is tiring to me. But I do not think this war offers much to think about. The surgical operation
against Zambia had continued for more than 20 days. Each day, thousands of aircraft sorties bombed it wildly, from laser-guided smart bombs dropped by carrier aircraft to carpet bombing by heavy bombers flying from Ascension Island, while cruisers and destroyers shelled it day and night with large-caliber naval guns. Little could remain of this poor African country, its air force of only 20-odd-old MiG fighters and its navy of a few Russian-built patrol boats had been destroyed within half an hour by the first wave of cruise missiles 20 days earlier. Its army's 200-odd obsolete tanks and armored vehicles were wiped out by airstrikes over the next 2 or 3 days.
After that, the attacks turned to every vehicle, road, and bridge inside Zambia,
And destroying those did not take long either. Now Zambia had been bombed back into the Stone Age.
2 of the 3 carrier battle groups that had taken part in the attack had already withdrawn. Only the Lincoln battle group remained to complete Operation First Ethic
and its final mission. Besides the Lincoln, the battle group included 1 Belknap-class cruiser, 2 Spruance-class destroyer, 2 Knox-class frigates, 2 Perry-class frigates, 1 Wichita-class replenishment ship, and 3 Invisible Herring-class attack submarines.
General Felix suddenly stopped in the middle of his pacing and looked at Captain Blair. Blair thought uncomfortably, this man really does resemble a scholar, and a neurasthenic one at that.
I still think we are too close to shore,
Felix said.
This lets us show the Zambians our presence more powerfully. I do not understand what worries you,
the captain said, waving his cigar.
The fleet, and especially the Lincoln, could indeed display its presence. It was the 5th Nimitz-class carrier, commissioned in 1989, displacing nearly 100,000 tons, more than 300 meters long and as high as a 20-story building, a steel city at sea that brought death.
Felix resumed pacing. Captain, you know my view. I have always had doubts about the survivability of aircraft carriers at sea in modern warfare. In my feelings, a carrier always seems like a thin-shelled egg floating on the ocean, terribly fragile.
You also know that at the Joint Chiefs and at arms hearings, I have always supported your view. But now the longest-range weapon the Zambian army may possess is a 55mm mortar, if they even have one, and it can only be hidden in a cellar. If they haul it out, it will be destroyed within 10 minutes. In fact, I too think this is a boring war. The military is declining spiritually, mainly because it lacks its own heroic idols. The wars of the late 20th century produced no heroes like Patton, MacArthur, or Eisenhower, because the opponents were too weak. This time is the same.
At that moment, a staff officer handed Felix a telegram. After reading it, Felix's face lit with joy. It was almost the first time since the attack began that he had truly smiled.
It seems this will all be over soon. The Zambian government has accepted every condition. They will soon hand over all biologists and genetic engineers inside Zambia, as well as all individuals whose genes have been reprogrammed. After all of that is completed, the head of state himself will surrender.
Felix handed the telegram to Blair. Blair tossed it onto the chart table without even looking at it. I told you this was a dull war.
Through the broad glass windows of the captain's room in the carrier island, the 2 generals saw a Marine helicopter fly in from the direction of the coast and land on the Lincoln's deck. Hita and several others climbed down. Under the muzzles of surrounding Marines, they lowered their heads and walked toward the island. Hita led them, still dressed in his national costume, like an old branch draped in a large piece of cloth.
After a while, the group entered the island and came into the captain's room. Except for Ita, whose eyes remained lowered, the others could not help looking around. If one looked only at the surroundings, this place seemed like the luxurious dining room of a European manor. Scarlet carpet, ornate paneled walls carved with reliefs, and large modernist oil paintings reflecting the captain's tastes. But when one looked upward, the ceiling was a tangle of complicated pipes, in strange contrast with everything around it. Outside the tall floor-to-ceiling windows, carrier aircraft roared up and down without pause.
Dr. Ita did not raise his head. He bent slightly in Felix's direction and said slowly in a weak voice,
Honorable General, I bring the sincere respect of the nation of Zambia. The godlike power of the fleet you command has filled us with terror. We submit and confess our guilt.
General Felix said,
Doctor, I hope you truly understand what you are doing.
We understand. Before the God of the civilized world, we kneel. We confess our guilt. But, General, when people are terribly hungry, they can no longer concern themselves with shame.
Ita said with a deep bow, The young staff officers around them all looked with contempt at the old stick of firewood before them.
Doctor?
Captain Blair, who had not spoken until then, called out. Ita raised his head slightly, and Blair spat in his face. Ita still stood motionless as a stone sculpture, letting the white saliva run down the deeply lined skin of his face and into his tangled beard. Felix shook his head regretfully.
You could have avoided hunger. If you had stayed in the civilized world, you might have won another Nobel Prize. Instead, you went to work for a totalitarian government that disregards even humanity's most basic ethics. I work for the people of Zambia. Ita bowed again.
You have brought disaster to the people of Zambia,
Felix said. No matter who brought this disaster, General, President Ruviga earnestly hopes it will end soon. To express that wish for peace, the king has also brought the general a small gift.
After saying this, Ida took from one of the people behind him a wooden cage the size of a bird cage. He set it on the carpet and gently opened its door. A snow-white little animal ran out, and every soldier in the captain's room exclaimed. It was a tiny horse. It was only the size of a kitten, but it ran across the carpet with strength and agility. Its snow-white mane streamed, its bright eyes looked curiously at the world, and then it gave a clear, melodious neigh. Stranger still, the little horse had a pair of snow-white wings. They seemed to be seeing a spirit from a fairy tale run into the room.
Ah, it is beautiful. I suppose this is a masterpiece of your genetic software?
Felix asked in delight. Ita bowed slightly again and answered. It is a genetic combination of horse and dove. Can it fly? No. Its wings do not have that much strength. Felix said.
Doctor, on behalf of Benna, I thank you. Benna is my 12-year-old granddaughter. She will be wild with joy over this gift.
May she be happy and beautiful. And may the future children of Zambia have 1/10 of her good fortune. 1/10 would be enough, General. Over the next 3 days, large numbers of transport helicopters flew frequently between Zambia's interior and the coast, carrying the genetically programmed
individuals surrendered by the Zambian government from the interior. They were all 15-year-old black people, the vast majority male. They were loaded onto transport ships and landing craft waiting along the coast, and each vessel set out to sea as soon as it was full.
Because the CIA had sent an urgent intelligence report, General Felix decided to summon Ita again. After Ita entered the captain's room, he immediately stared out the window. On the nearby sea, several huge Chinook transport helicopters were hovering over a transport ship, and dark-skinned
individuals were constantly climbing out of their cabins, descending rope ladders to the heavily guarded deck, and then being shoved by armed soldiers into the holds. Felix came to Ita's side and watched the scene at sea with him.
These are the last few shiploads. In 3 days we have moved 20,000 individuals.
Where are they being sent?
Ita asked.
Doctor, that is not something you or I need to concern ourselves with.
Felix said coldly.
This great ship we are aboard is called the Lincoln, is it not?
Ita asked suddenly. Felix nodded blankly. Why would it have that name? In the century before last, African black slaves were carried away like this. Their genes had not been reprogrammed. Felix smiled and shook his head.
These are two different things, Doctor. I can promise that while these individuals remain under my jurisdiction, they will receive humane treatment as far as possible. Even wild animals should be protected. But that is all. Their later fate has nothing to do with me, and nothing to do with you either.
Seeing Ita silent, Felix continued.
Now, let us talk business. Doctor, I know those individuals are much healthier than normal people, but sometimes they also suffer from diseases normal people do not get. Recently, for example, a skin disease spread among the individuals. It is not fatal, but it causes great suffering. To stop its spread,
You developed an inoculating vaccine and commissioned a European pharmaceutical company to produce it. As far as I know, the total quantity of vaccine already delivered was enough for 40,000 individuals.
Felix noticed that one of Ita's hands, hidden beneath the cloth, trembled almost imperceptibly. But Ita's tone remained slow and heavy. There are only a little over 20,000 individuals, General. Felix nodded.
I am willing to believe that, Doctor. I have only one small request. May we take a look at the remaining 20,000 doses of vaccine? Just a look. We will not take them away. They are useless to normal people. Ita said nothing. Are you going to say they were destroyed in the bombing?
Ita slowly shook his head. No. Those vaccines have all been used. General, I know perfectly well that you already know everything. Yes, Doctor, you lied. The reprogrammed fertilized eggs from 15 years ago were not 20,000 individuals. Hand them over immediately.
Ita turned his withered body toward Felix, his eyes still lowered, which made him seem like a blind man. He said, "General, I have the feeling that you are a man who understands." Felix raised his eyebrows and asked,
"Oh, in what respects?"
Many respects. For example, are you truly leading this war with the passion of a crusader? Felix shook his head. No, I regard my mission with a very rational attitude. As for the international community's fuss over this affair, I find it somewhat affected.
Ita remained unmoved, but Captain Blair beside him shifted his gaze from Ita to Felix and stared at him in surprise. "General."
With the rapid advance of genetic engineering in the first 2 decades of this century, the religious mood of human society has also grown stronger. On the surface, this is reverence for and defense of bioethics, but in truth, it is humanity trying to find spiritual support in a technological society that leaves it bewildered.
Blair cried out. How can you say that, General? You should know that reprogramming the human genome is equivalent to placing human beings on the same level as machines that humans can manufacture at will. It will destroy the foundations of the entire legal and ethical system of modern civilization.
You have memorized the television lines very well, Felix said with a dismissive smile.
But the faith and ethical system you speak of are based on Western Christian culture, and other cultures do not necessarily accept that system. In Dr. Ita's African culture, the concept of a creator is very vague. For example, the Maasai once said, when God set out to create the world, he found there already a Dorobo, a hunter tribe, an elephant, and a snake. That means humanity and other living things existed beforehand. They were spontaneous creations. There are not nearly so many taboos against human intervention in the evolution of life as there are in Western Christian culture.
Even within Western culture itself, its law and ethics will not collapse because of reprogramming the human genome. In fact, for much smaller reasons, we have long been violating the first ethic. Cloned humans in this century, test tube babies in the last, and earlier still, when our noble ladies wanted less trouble and responsibility, they did not hesitate too much before choosing abortion. In the face of these facts, our legal and ethical system seems to have adapted quite realistically, with not the slightest sign of collapse. As for the Western world's great alarm over what happened in Africa, that is merely because we do not need to fill our bellies with wild grass and leaves.
Blair was dumbfounded for a long moment, then shook his head in confusion. Felix smiled at Ita and said, "Do not mind him, Doctor. Captain Blair clearly does not often think about such problems."
My duty is not to think,
the captain said, sulking.
General Felix is a man who understands.
Ita said sincerely, "I have been frank enough. Now, Doctor, may I ask how you saw through me at a glance?"
Not at a glance. We met more than 10 years ago at a cocktail party at MIT. You were then a brigadier general in charge of recruit training at a boot camp in South Carolina. You said that among American youth today, one could recruit soldiers like scientists, soldiers like engineers, soldiers like artists, but it was becoming harder and harder to recruit soldiers like soldiers. Then you said genetic engineering might create qualified soldiers for America. That was the first time a military man had said such a thing at a meeting of biologists. So I remembered you.
That is truly a good idea. Captain Blair nodded approvingly.
So, Captain, when there is a need, ethics is ultimately secondary.
Felix said to Blair, trying hard to hide his contempt, "Then, General, you must understand my plea. Please spare those 20,000 Zambians." Ita bowed repeatedly to the commander of Operation First Ethic. He looked exactly like an old beggar. Felix shook his head firmly.
Doctor, I am a soldier, carrying out a mission. That has nothing to do with my view of genetic engineering. I say again, hand over those 20,000 individuals, even if you believe they are Zambia's future. General, they are the future of all humanity.
That is meaningless. We not only know for certain that those 20,000 individuals exist, we can even guess where they are hidden. If you refuse to hand them over, we can only bomb those jungles. Felix chopped his hand downward as he spoke. Do you know how we will bomb them?
Blair leaned his face close to Ita and said,
Not with planes from the Lincoln. They are too small. Giant bombers from Ascension Base will come, loaded with incendiaries. They will drop bombs across those jungle areas along X-shaped diagonals so that no matter which way the wind blows, a perfect fire field will form. The temperature inside it can melt bridges. Not even bacteria will survive.
Felix continued.
Well, Doctor, even for the sake of those individuals, you should hand them over.
Ita lamented something in the local language. His whole body swayed as if it had lost support. Give me a telephone. I will convey your meaning to the government.
Very good. Also explain that we cannot use the previous transfer method. Transporting 20,000 people from the interior by helicopter is too difficult, and guerrillas continue to attack the landing sites and routes. We require you to bring those 20,000 individuals to the coast, here on this coastal plain, under the fleet's fire control. You will do all of this yourselves, and then we will receive them all at once with landing craft.
I will convey it. Ita nodded weakly.
As Ita followed the escorting Marines to the door of the captain's room, he suddenly turned around. The Americans were astonished to find that his back was no longer bent. Now he stood straight, and only then could they see how tall he had been all along. From the dark hollows of his eyes, like black pools with no bottom, two cold beams shot out, making everyone present shiver.
Leave Africa.
Ita said.
What did you say? Captain Blair asked. Ita ignored him, turned, and strode out. The strength and force of those steps were completely unlike the man he had been before.
What did he say?
Blair turned and asked the others.
"He told us to leave Africa," Felix said, his eyes fixed thoughtfully on the direction in which Ita had gone. He certainly has a sense of humor. Blair burst into laughter. After night fell, General Felix stood in the captain's room, absorbed in watching the little horse the Zambians had given him. It stood on the broad chart table, eating with relish the cabbage an orderly had just brought. Then Felix rose and went outside onto the bridge. He gazed at the distant African coast. A hot wind blew into his face, carrying the smell of smoke. The far land was shrouded in red light. Zambia's cities were burning. Firelight reddened half the night sky and reflected in the seawater, forming a false dawn.
General, I can see that you are worried. Captain Blair had also quietly come onto the bridge and asked from behind Felix.
We are facing a nation driven into a corner,
Felix said, looking at the burning continent. So what? In this world, eggs are eggs and stones are stones. I believe everything will go smoothly.
I hope so. I remember very clearly that day more than 40 years ago. I was with several Marines on the roof of the embassy in Saigon, and helicopters were evacuating the last people. The North Vietnamese army under General Van Tien Dung was only a few hundred meters away, and America's sphere of influence in Vietnam had been reduced to those few dozen square meters on the embassy roof. A shell came in. A Marine was blown in two across the chest. I still remember his name. He was the last American soldier to die in Vietnam. That moment was carved into my heart. From then on, I understood that war is a very profound thing, and no one can truly see through it.
When Felix was awakened by a lieutenant colonel on his staff, dawn was just beginning to show. The officer told him that more than 20,000 Zambians had assembled at the designated stretch of coast. They seemed to be the 20,000 individuals turned over by the Zambian government.
Impossible, not this fast. Felix shouted, staring at the officer. How could they assemble? Most of Zambia's roads and railways are difficult to use. Even with clear roads and enough vehicles, they could not gather 20,000 people this quickly.
Felix got up, snatched up a pair of binoculars, and rushed onto the bridge. The early morning sea wind made him shiver. The bridge was already full of naval officers observing the shore through binoculars, Captain Blair among them.
Looking ashore, the binoculars showed a vast plain stretching inland from the coast. Smoke from burning cities rose like an enormous black-gray curtain behind the plain. Felix saw a few black dots on the horizon. The dots gradually became black lines, and soon those lines joined together, edging the horizon in black. General Felix immediately saw that these were not the 20,000 waiting.
Individuals.
To be received, but an army unit preparing to attack. They advanced in ordered formation. Felix lowered the binoculars and could see with his naked eye that the Zambian army was gradually covering the plain like a black carpet. He raised the binoculars again and saw the line accelerate. Soon, the whole formation was running. The black soldiers lifted their submachine guns and roared, rushing toward the sea like a tide.
Are the Zambians going to throw themselves into the sea? Everyone in the fleet who witnessed the magnificent scene was bewildered. On the Lincoln, General Felix was the first to notice something. His face went white. He threw down the binoculars and screamed hoarsely,
"Battle alarm! Naval guns! Fire! Launch every attack aircraft! Quickly!"
The battle alarm shrieked. Among the Zambian infantry line that had reached the shore, a vast patch of white suddenly appeared. That white patch shook violently, raising a high cloud of dust, and for a moment the people of the fleet could not believe their eyes.
Every Zambian soldier had a pair of white wings. These were more than 20,000 people who could fly.
Above the dust, the flying men rose into the air. Their airborne line was a dark mass that blocked the rising sun, and this aerial army crossed the sea toward the fleet. By then, the fleet's Aegis system had already responded to the incoming flying men. The first ship-to-air missiles shot from the cruisers around the Lincoln toward them. About 50 white smoke trails stabbed into the mass of flying men. All the first missiles struck their targets. Crisp explosions sounded from the sky, and after flashes of light, black smoke blossomed within the mass. The flying men who were hit were torn apart, and white feathers from their wings drifted through the sky like tiny flakes of snow.
The people watching from the carrier burst into cheers. But General Felix and Captain Blair, who observed the attack's effect rationally, felt their hearts turn cold. A simple and cruel arithmetic problem lay before them.
Judging from the present situation, when each anti-aircraft missile hit, the lethal force of its warhead could bring down 2 or 3 nearby flying men. The fleet's ship-to-air missile warheads were designed to destroy point targets such as aircraft. When they exploded, they produced only a small number of high-speed fragments, so their area killing power was not great. And after being attacked by missiles, the flying men were spreading out quickly. Soon each ship-to-air missile would be able to bring down only 1 flying man. Ship-to-ship missiles and cruise missiles with stronger area lethality were useless against targets at this bearing and distance.
There was another fatal weakness. Less than half of the fleet's ship-to-air missiles used traditional infrared radar or laser guidance. Most of those were Sea Javelin, Sea Sparrow, and Javelin.
Ship-to-air missiles prepared in the last century. In recent years,
What this powerful fleet had truly taken pride in were pixel-guided ship-to-air missiles. Pixel guidance had been a long-pursued dream of last century's missile designers. Under this guidance mode, the target perceived by the missile was no longer a point as in traditional guidance, but a three-dimensional image. Through superb pattern-matching technology, the missile identified the target as if it had been given a pair of intelligent eyes. This allowed the missile to strike the most vital part of a target, so the warhead of a pixel-guided missile could be greatly reduced compared with traditional missiles.
But now, to those intelligent eyes, the flying men did not look like aerial targets that needed to be attacked. They looked more like large birds. So the smart missiles all made a rational choice. They went around them. Artificial intelligence once again became artificial stupidity. There was no time at all to replace the pattern database in every missile.
The entire fleet carried about 3,000 ship-to-air missiles, already twice the normal load. Guided by the Aegis
system, that number of missiles was enough to deal with an attack on the fleet by all the air power of a major nation, perhaps around 2,000 enemy aircraft. But now the fleet faced 10 times that number of flying men. Of course, each flying man could not attack a ship with the power of an aircraft, but to shoot one down still required one missile. Using carrier fighters against the flying men followed the same logic, and besides, the fighters might not have time to take off. And so the two generals, commanders of the most powerful fleet on the planet, now had to admit this reality.
Against flying men, the main weapons of a carrier battle group no longer possessed an advantage. Quality could not replace quantity.
Around the Lincoln, ship-to-air missiles launched in waves, their trails weaving a gigantic tangle in the sky. No one in the fleet cheered now. Even ordinary sailors had solved that arithmetic problem, and the thing they had always been proudest of could no longer be relied upon.
When every ship-to-air missile had been exhausted, fewer than 2,000 flying men had been hit. By then, the leading edge of the flying men line charging from the shore had already swept past the battle group's outer cruisers and destroyers and was rushing straight toward the Lincoln.
Now the fleet could rely only on naval guns and machine gun fire. Almost every naval gun fired at full power. The most effective weapon against the flying men was the phalanx gun system, originally used to shoot down antiship missiles that broke through the fleet's defenses within a range of 1,500 meters. It consisted of 6 20mm barrels and had a high rate of fire of 3,000 rounds per minute. Each burst from a phalanx traced a curve of death through the air, and a row of flying men was brought down by its dense stream of shells.
But the phalanx could not fire continuously for long. Its high rate of fire and high muzzle velocity quickly overheated and aged the barrels, which had to be replaced frequently. Since there were only limited numbers of them, they ultimately could not form an effective barrier against such masses of attackers. Other large-caliber naval guns fired too slowly. Meanwhile, the flying men's flight paths were constantly undulating sine waves. Shooting at them with ordinary naval guns was like trying to shoot butterflies with rifles. The hit rate was very low. So now the only weapons they could depend on were machine guns.
At that moment, an old Chinese saying about cold weapon warfare surfaced in Felix's mind.
No more than 3 shots before the enemy closes.
It meant that in the time before enemy cavalry reached the position, an archer could loose only 3 arrows. It reflected the Lincoln's present situation perfectly.
Now the flying men began their assault on the Lincoln. They approached the carrier at every altitude. The highest flew above 1,000 meters, while the lowest skimmed just over the sea. Nearly 20,000 flying men enveloped the Lincoln in a deadly dark cloud. The people on the carrier heard shouts from every direction, voices that made their scalps prickle. Looking up at the dense mass of flying men circling overhead and blotting out the sunlight, they seemed trapped inside a nightmare. At the same time, they realized a harsh reality. After decades immersed in the hotbed of high technology, they had finally gained a chance to become true warriors. They would have to fight the enemy face to face, hand to hand.
Once he realized this, Felix actually became much calmer. He picked up a loudspeaker and issued orders steadily.
Immediately distribute all small arms to the ship's personnel. Concentrate defense on the island, elevator openings, magazines, aviation fuel stores, and nuclear reactors. This is the Supreme Commander speaking. All hands, prepare for close combat with the enemy.
Captain Blair stared blankly at General Felix. Only after a long moment did he understand the meaning of those words. He walked silently to the chart table, opened a drawer, and took out his pistol. He looked at the gun, thinking without a word. Suddenly he heard a melodious neigh. It came from the little winged horse. The captain raised the gun at the little horse and fired 3 shots. The beautiful little spirit fell in a pool of blood.
Another awkward situation no one had prepared for appeared. On early carriers, small arms had been stored separately at each battle station. But since no shipboard personnel had had a chance to use small arms since World War II, at some unknown point modern carriers had begun to store all small arms together in a dedicated armory. The Lincoln carried nearly 6,000 people. Aside from those who could not leave their posts, nearly 4,000 rushed toward the armory in the middle levels of the carrier to draw weapons, blocking the narrow passages at once. At the armory door, the chaos was even worse. The officers responsible for issuing weapons could only throw guns into the crowd. Those who received guns could not squeeze out, so they could only pass them backward. It looked very much like the scene of a modern urban uprising.
At this moment, the Lincoln's broad flight deck could only be defended by the small number of Marines aboard.
The first flying man landed on the Lincoln's flight deck. His snow-white wings trembled lightly, and his feet made no sound when they touched the deck. Now no one would think he was a demon. He was a figure from Greek myth, an incarnation of divinity, arriving from ancient dreams like a beautiful illusion descending into humanity's crude steel world. The Marines on the deck were stunned by his astonishing beauty. Many stood dazed and forgot to fire. But the flying warrior was quickly cut down by bullets from every direction. He fell on the deck, and the white feathers of his wings were stained red by his own blood.
3 more flying men landed immediately afterward. One survived and hid behind an optical landing guidance device on the port side of the flight deck, exchanging fire with the Marines.
After several more flying men landed and were killed, the flying warriors realized that landing now was too costly. They began throwing grenades down at the carrier from the air. The people aboard the carrier tasted what it was like to be bombed. After a large group of flying men roared over the flight deck, grenades fell clattering like hail. Then, amid explosions, the expensive
Tomcats and Hornets
still parked on the deck were blown one by one into fragments. The grenades from the air successfully suppressed the carrier's small arms fire. The flying men's second forced landing succeeded. Soon more than 100 flying warriors had boarded the Lincoln. Using the recessed structures on the port and starboard sides and the wreckage of aircraft on the deck as cover, they fought the ship's Marines and sailors, covering more flying men as they landed.
Now the Lincoln's defenders faced the most embarrassing situation. First, they were inferior in the quality of personnel. The flying men, optimized by genes and raised in the African jungle, were natural warriors. In this traditional close combat, they were brave, agile, and irresistible. The people on the Lincoln, except for a small number of Marines, were less soldiers than engineers and technicians. They had little ground combat training, and in this brutal close fight, they were no match for the flying warriors. Most pitiful of all were the pilots. These airborne killers who had once terrified so many enemies, the blade of the carrier battle group, were now nothing.
From the window of the captain's room, Blair sadly saw a lieutenant colonel pilot crouched in the cockpit of an F-14, firing wildly with a pistol. Even after his magazine was empty, he kept pulling the trigger until a flying man with red and black stripes painted on his face climbed onto the aircraft and cut off his head with a hunting knife.
What the executors of First Ethic
could bear even less was that they were now at a disadvantage in weapons as well. In such close combat, Their M16 rifles were not much better than the old AK-47s in the hands of the Zambian flying men. Moreover, the Lincoln's small arms armory held fewer than 2,000 rifles, so most people aboard had to fight with pistols. The Lincoln's 6,000 officers and crew were nothing more than a heap of flesh trapped inside steel.
On the flight deck, the size of 3 football fields, flying men were still landing rapidly. Their number aboard had already passed 1,000. The Lincoln still had the advantage in numbers, but most of its people had been trapped inside the ship by the flying men's grenade bombing from the air. The flight deck was gradually being controlled by the flying warriors. Now they had 2 priority targets. One was the aircraft elevator openings, the widest passages into the body of the ship. The other was the island, the carrier's nerve center.
A group of flying men swept past outside the captain's room. Grenades could be heard clanging against the bulkhead. One smashed through a window and landed on the chart table. Looking at the smoking, spinning object, General Felix seemed to enter a tunnel of time and flash back to his youth. It was in a Vietnamese jungle under tropical rain. At 18, he had also seen a grenade spinning before his eyes with smoke rising from it. Even its shape was the same as this one, a standard former Warsaw Pact weapon, with green body and green handle. All his feelings about history and reality condensed into this single instant between life and death. The general stared at the thing in a trance, and only a staff officer who threw him to the floor saved him.
A dozen minutes later, more than 2,000 flying men had landed. They completely controlled the flight deck and had successfully blocked reinforcements from the surrounding cruisers and destroyers. Seen from outside, the Lincoln was now covered with flying men. The hoarse, rough gunfire of AK submachine guns drowned everything out, while the thin cracks of M16 rifles could be heard only here and there.
Suddenly, Captain Blair heard an explosion from the direction of the elevators. Compared with the grenade blasts ringing everywhere, it was muffled and barely audible. His heart sank at once. As an experienced military man, he could not mishear it. The flying warriors were using plastic explosives to blast open the watertight doors inside the hull. They had entered the Lincoln. Felix realized this as well. He knew that the internal structure of a modern giant carrier was extremely complex, and even ship's personnel could get lost without a map. But for the flying warriors, this might not be too great an obstacle, because the places they were looking for were all large and clearly located.
The Lincoln had 3 fatal points: the magazine, the aviation fuel store containing 8,000 tons of jet fuel for the combat aircraft, and the 2 pressurized water nuclear reactors that powered the entire ship. If the flying warriors found any one of the 3, the Lincoln was doomed. At the same time, a nuclear carrier was an extremely complex system, and arbitrary damage inside it could also have fatal consequences.
That ominous explosion sounded again. Each blast was deeper and more muffled than the last, like the footsteps of a huge beast moving step by step into the depths of the Lincoln. Now the ending was only a matter of time.
More than 5,000 flying men had landed. Fighting on the deck had basically stopped while the command island had almost lost contact with the whole ship and the outside world. Although the island had not completely fallen, the Lincoln had lost its brain.
Over the next hour and more, the Lincoln became almost quiet. Only explosions inside the hull could be faintly heard, spreading in different directions. The flying warriors were like countless ants entering the body of the giant beast that was the Lincoln, devouring its internal organs. At the same time, the flying men intensified their attack on the island. While assaulting it from below, they also jumped directly from the air onto the upper structures of the island.
Suddenly, the Lincoln trembled slightly. Blair rushed to the window and saw great clouds of white steam rising from both sides of the hull. He heard a rumbling sound, seawater boiling under the ship. The captain knew that the flying warriors had found one of the Lincoln's 3 fatal points, the nuclear reactors. Although the reactors were in the lowest part of the hull, their positions were the clearest. The flying warriors had evidently blown up the reactor cooling systems. Blair could imagine the reactor material flowing out like volcanic magma, yet many times hotter than magma. When it reached the carrier's bottom, it was like placing red-hot coal on hard cardboard. It would quickly burn through the hull.
Another hailstorm of grenades fell around the captain's room. After deafening explosions, dense AK fire rang outside like a sudden burst of wild laughter. The Marines defending the captain's room fell one after another at the door and windows. A group of flying warriors smashed the door open and rushed in, their wings folded behind them like white cloaks. Captain Blair reached for the pistol lying on the chart, and he and several young staff officers were immediately shot dead by quick-eyed flying warriors. General Felix held a pistol, but did not raise it. The flying warrior stared at the 4 stars on his shoulder and did not fire again. They stood facing one another like that.
The flying men suddenly parted to either side, and Dr. Ito walked in. He still wore that piece of cloth, in sharp contrast with the flying warriors in their military gear. One flying man, in awkward English, told Felix to put down his weapon.
Felix still gripped the pistol. With his other hand, he straightened his uniform. "Shoot, black bastard." Dr. Ito raised his head, and Felix once again saw those deep eyes. "General, our blood is red too. You may sink the Lincoln, but not one of you will get away."
Ito smiled. It was the first time Felix had seen him smile.
Of course they can get away. They can fly across borders at will. Radar systems cannot distinguish them from birds. They can find food everywhere. Even in modern society, it will not be easy to eliminate such a group of people. More important, they will soon become legal human beings and enjoy every right that belongs to a person. I do not understand that.
You are an intelligent man. As you yourself said, even in the so-called civilized world, when there is a need, ethics is secondary. People there certainly do not need to eat wild grass and leaves, but they certainly need to fly. That is humanity's oldest dream, and no one can resist its temptation. You will see that the imagined demons do not exist. The age of angels is about to arrive. In that beautiful age, humanity will fly above cities and fields, and the blue sky and white clouds will be the gardens where they stroll. Humanity will also swim beneath the sea like fish, and enjoy all of this with lives lasting thousands of years. General, you have already seen the dawn of that age.
After Dr. Ito finished speaking, he turned and walked out. At the same time, he said something in Zambian. Then all the flying warriors turned and left. Not one of them looked at Felix again.
The aircraft carrier Lincoln did not completely sink until dusk. When the island was the last part of the ship to submerge, the air squeezed from it gave a great shriek, like a desolate horn from the African coast. General Felix stood on the bridge of a cruiser, looking with bewildered eyes toward the ancient land in the distance.
Over that land where humanity had been born 1,000,000 years before, the flying men were circling in the sunset.